It's an honor and a pleasure to be in conversation with you. A personal question first. How did you get interested in Sanskritam and in the Itihasas and the Puranas?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And let me thank Prabhu Chawla specifically and the ThinkEdu conclave for having invited me here. That question I can answer at two different levels. But before that, as a prelude, because some of you may not know, that the reason I'm here is because for several years now, I have been translating a certain class of Sanskrit texts from Sanskrit to English. The Mahabharata. These, when I say translations, these are all unabridged translations. The Mahabharata. When I translated the Mahabharata, often people asked me, why did you translate the Mahabharata? Surely there are any number of translations of the Mahabharata floating around in the world. The answer is contrary to what you might think. There are only 3 unabridged translations of the Mahabharata. The others that you see are abridged translations of the Mahabharata. The 3 unabridged translations of the Mahabharata are one that was done by Kishori Mohan Ganguly in the 1880s, the second one by Manmathanath Datta in the 1890s, and the third one is mine, which probably establishes that Bengalis tend to be somewhat eccentric. After doing the Mahabharata, I did the Bhagavad Gita, but forget that. After doing the Mahabharata, I did the Harivangsha. For those of you who do not know, the Harivangsha is loosely referred to as a Purana, but it is really something like an appendix to the Mahabharata. When we meet Krishna in the Mahabharata, he is an adult, so a question is asked about his childhood exploits. Those are there in the Puranas also, but they're also in the Harivangsha. So I did the Harivangsha. After that, inevitably, I did an unabridged translation of the Valmiki Ramayana. And for the Valmiki Ramayana, it's shorter, more popular. So there are 5 unabridged translations of the Valmiki Ramayana in English. To give you some idea of the magnitude, the Mahabharata is believed to have 100,000 shlokas. My 10-volume translation amounts to 2.25 million words. After composing the Mahabharata, Veda Vyasa, and perhaps if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about Veda Vyasa, is believed to have composed 18 Mahapuranas. Again, if we have time, we'll talk about what these Mahapuranas are. These Mahapuranas collectively amount to 400,000 shlokas. So converted into English word counts, it will be upwards of 12 million words. And unlike the Mahabharata and the Valmiki Ramayana, except for the Bhagavat Puran, which is one of the most popular ones, and the Vishnu Puran, the others have not been translated at all in unabridged form, word for word, into English. So I've started on this hazardous task of translating the 18 Mahapuranas. I've completed 6 of them, 4 have been published. The publisher for all these translations are Penguin. The 4 that have been published are the Bhagavat Puran, the Markandeya Puran, the Brahma Puran, and the Vishnu Puran. The 2 that are awaiting publication are the Shiva Puran and the Brahmanda Puran, which will be published this year. I'm now on the 7th, which is the Matsya Puran. So that is the prelude. I can give two kinds of answers. One kind of answer I would typically give a Western audience, that these are important texts which were not being translated, and if they were being translated, they were being translated by Westerners, and criticizing the Westerners for not getting the nuances right is negative unless we do our own translations. And the Sanskrit scholars, the Sanskrit Pandits were not interested in translating these, and hence I decided to get into this. So this is an answer I've given a Western kind of audience. For an Indian audience like this, the argument or the proposition that I decided to do these translations is completely false. I think the right assertion is the translations just happened. They were just being done through me. I happened to be the instrument.
That's so nice. That's wonderful. In our Itihasas and Puranas, there's a lot of science, a lot of truth, which is couched in the form of stories and other kinds of literature. How do we take that scientific facts from this? Because the next generation is one that questions and doesn't take anything just like that at face value. So how do we take out these facts and then give it to them?
Let me leave the Valmiki Ramayana out of it now, because everything else that I'm translating was composed by Veda Vyasa. Let's leave Valmiki Ramayana out. Valmiki was a superb poet. All of this is poetry, but Valmiki in particular was a great poet, particularly in descriptions of nature. Now, so far as this corpus is concerned, this corpus is called the Itihasa Purana corpus. Itihasa in particular is applied to the Ramayana, Valmiki Ramayana and Mahabharata and the Puranas. Itihasa, Itihasa translates into English as this is indeed what occurred. So this is history. In dumbed down versions of Itihas Purana, we have reduced them to stories. So and so came along, so and so shot so and so did so and so. These are dumbed down. We do not realize that 1/3 of the Mahabharata is Shanti Parva and Anushasana Parva, when Bhishma is lying down on his bed of arrows and is teaching Yudhishthira and his brothers. Often one asks, what are texts of Hinduism? And typically one will say Vedanta, Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita. If one looks at the series of books that were edited and got translated by Max Muller and the Sacred Books of the East series, you will find Vedanta, Upanishads, a little bit of Dharma Shastras and Kalidasa literature. Vedanta Upanishads are meant for people who are interested in moksha, in being free from this world of existence or samsara. All of our texts say, including the Bhagavad Gita, that amongst crores and crores of people, only a few will ever embark on that journey of moksha or mukti. The rest of us are stuck in samsara. In other words, we are not going to go off on vanaprastha and sannyas. We are going to be grihasthas. Thousands of years ago we were grihasthas. Today also we are grihasthas. We are householders. We are trying to pursue artha and kama, hopefully through legitimate means, and we are pursuing dharma as we see fit. This description of what the grihastha should do, what the householder should do, will not be there in texts on Vedanta. They will be there in texts like Itihasa and Purana, to a lesser extent Dharma Shastras. That's the reason we should read them. To give an example, to give two examples, you mentioned science, but before that, there is a national mission on manuscripts, Namami. Namami estimates, mind you, that there are 40 million manuscripts floating around in the country, not just in public collections, private collections also. Namami's estimates are that 95% of these have not been translated. They are not in Sanskrit always, some of them are in Pali. If they are not translated, we do not even know what is in them. Until we know what is in them, how on earth will we judge whether there is information of value or not? Unfortunately, on both sides of the debate, people who think that everything was in these texts and people who believe that nothing was in these texts, none of them bother to read the original texts. And my plea to everyone is, please read these texts. Specifically, let me give you an example from the Markandeya Purana. In the Markandeya Purana, there is a reference to a demoness named Jata Harini. Jata Harini, as the name implies, is a demoness which steals a newborn infant. She goes to a house where there's a newborn infant, steals that, goes to another house where there's another newborn infant, replaces that infant with this infant, takes away that infant, goes to another house, keeps replacing in this fashion and causes general confusion. Jata Harini. The Markandeya Purana tells us in the process, she devours every third child. Anyone interested in the social sciences will immediately deduce that whenever these texts were composed, the infant mortality rate was 1/3, 333 per thousand. Not something that will occur to Sanskrit scholars, which is why these need to be read in Sanskrit. If you do not know Sanskrit, they need to be read in unabridged form so that we can bring a multidisciplinary lens to bear on those. Across all of these texts, there are descriptions of the earth's dimensions. And by the way, these texts that I'm only interested in a certain class of texts. I'm not interested in translating the Sulla Sutras, which will give you a statement of a specific Pythagoras theorem. It will give you a much more precise definition of pi, measurement of pi. These texts also talk about the dimensions of the earth, dimensions of the moon, from all of which you can deduce a certain value of pi, which is not 3.14. But the direct answer to your question is, there's a lot of information on what you would call science, a lot of information on geography, geology, grammar, evolution of language, governance, the whole works. Therefore, this corpus has been described as the Pancham Veda.
That was a lot of information. Thank you. Is there a need for groups of scholars to actually work on bringing out all these scientific material from this in the form of books, lectures, articles, etc.?
Well, again, I'll draw a distinction. There are these texts that I am translating, and there are other texts. the Shulla Sutras, for example. Now, there are people who have written papers on the mathematics part of it, including Pingala, who in some sense was the originator of combinatorics. Manjul Bhargav has written occasionally on this. Shailendra Mehta has written occasionally on this. There are several papers on the mathematics part of it, particularly combinatorics. But I cannot think of any book, satisfactory book that has been written yet. Like for China, there is this book by Joseph Needham. I forget what it is called, History of Science and Technology in China. I do not think there is anything comparable that has been written yet in India. So it is waiting for someone to write it.
And while that should happen, don't you also think that this should go at an academic level? Fine. But to the common man, for him to understand and for students to understand that there is so much of scientific material in our ancient texts.
Let me be very clear. Yes, I agree with you, but let me be very clear. Whatever is the definition of the common person, I am not translating for the common person. Now, please do not misunderstand my choice of words. The common person, particularly in this day and age, believes that everything should be reduced to Itihas Purana for dummies in 140 characters. It should be ready like instant coffee. I am translating these texts in unabridged form. So translating them requires a lot of patience. Reading them requires a lot of patience. So for the entry level person, I do not believe my translations are the right texts. They will probably read something else in abridged form and then feel motivated enough, incentivized enough to delve into these, because that's the reason I gave the size, because these are huge, huge texts.
Absolutely. How far do you think we can rely on the ancient texts, especially the Itihasas and Puranas, as reliable sources of history?
History, it depends a little bit on what you mean by history and how you define history. Because history throughout the world has been the history of kings and so on and so forth. Now let's take a specific example. Suppose I'm talking about something like the dating of the Kurukshetra war. Whenever I'm going to look at something like the dating of the Kurukshetra war, I want several different sources of information to validate each other. There are astronomical references in the Mahabharata and some other texts also. If I include the Puranas also, there are about 200 shlokas that have some bearing on the dating of the Kurukshetra war. Notice that sometimes there is some subjectivity involved, because in some parts of the country, the month ended with Amavasya, in some parts it ended with Purnima. We use lunar calendars, not solar calendars. Our calculations were based on nakshatras, not on rashis. Plus, there is subjectivity in interpreting the words. So, I've got that astronomical knot. I have got the geological information now, which is, to give one example of that, about the drying up of the Saraswati. I have information about the evolution of Sanskrit grammar, the way certain expressions are used in even a text like the Bhagavad Gita. I have some degree of genetic information. I also have information from epigraphic records. I also have information that is in the nature of archaeology. Now, if I bring all of these together, you will find that the difference is probably not more than 400 years across all of these different sources. So, therefore, if I put all of these together, something like the Kurukshetra war was history. To give another example of that, in the Puranas, I have spoken about the Puranas, there are specific references to genealogical trees. So I can date the number of years that have elapsed between the crowning of Parikshit and the crowning of Mahapadmananda, which is of course externally validated in some sense from the Greek sources. So these are history, except for Parjitar many years ago and Pusalkar after that, no one has bothered to look at these texts, the texts I am talking about, as Itihasa history, because they are typically dismissed as myth. And if you do not do that exploration, how will you be able to test?
And how far do you think astronomical dating is reliable for our Puranas?
For
and
the
Itihasas?
Kurukshetra war?
Or for any other incident that has happened in the Itihasas?
Today, it is impossible to date these texts. Let me talk about the 18 Puranas. In all probability, what happened was there was an original Purana text. Over a period of time, because much of this was through oral transmission. Over a period of time, through oral transmission, this got divided into 18 different Puranas. For example, if I were to ask people here, how many parvas does the Mahabharata have? Most people will say 18 parvas. But within the Mahabharata, there is also a classification of 100 parvas. So some of these classifications were done subsequently. So if I look at texts like the Puranas, as we have them today, these Puranas were not composed in their present form. And today it is impossible to filter out what could have been the original Purana. As they exist now, the range of composition ranges from something like the 3rd century CE to about the 12th century CE. So that's a vast range. And quite clearly, some of these Puranas are older and more reliable. These are, the poetry is better. Therefore, you can sort of date them. So the astronomical observations also tend to vary a lot from the Purana to Purana. And naturally, by the very nature of their texts, there have been embellishments over a period of time.
So would you call these interpolations also?
Interpolations, you see, interpolations, embellishments, let us not play with words. What it really means is today we do not know what the original texts were. Let me give an example of that. And the example I'm going to give to you is a very familiar example. I'm going to recite a shloka, and I want you to tell me where it is from. And don't immediately answer. Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvhavati parantapa abhyuthanang adharmasya tadatmanang srijamaham. Any guesses where this is from? I said don't jump to the answer. The Bhagavad Gita says, Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvhavati bharata abhyuthanang adharmasya tadatmanang sayamang. That's not what I quoted. I quoted, Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvhavati parantapa abhyuthanang adharmasya tadatmanang sayamang. What's the difference? All of this was Sanskrit poetry stuck to different chandas. And the most popular chanda was Anushtup, which had 8 aksharas per line. We sometimes do not even realize it is Anushtup, 8 aksharas per line. Dharma Kshetre Kurukshetre 8. Samaveta 8. Saraswati Mahabhage 8. Vakratunda Mahakaya 8. Ya Devi Sarva Bhuteshu 8. Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvhavati parantapa, the chanda breaks down. It is no longer Anushtup. Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvhavati bharata, it is Anushtup. So just by looking at the poetry, you can figure out that this was a later poet, not as skilled.
Very interesting. Just one last question. How do we get youngsters to read the Itihasas and Puranas to make them interested in it?
To make them
interested in our ancient literature? I know it's an uphill task, there are many distractions, but could you give us a clue as to how we can go about it?
I don't know the answer to that. You see, so let me give you a roundabout response. It's not really an answer. About 100 years ago, a lot of people were familiar with Sanskrit. About 50 years ago, a lot of people were very comfortable with the vernacular. And I'm not using the word vernacular in any normative sense. So people were familiar with the stories from the Puranas because they had been told, retold, unabridged form in the vernacular. Children used to hear these stories from their grandparents. We now have a generation, and I'm just stating it as a factual statement, which does not know Sanskrit, which has lost touch with the vernacular, which has lost touch with a family system where the grandparents taught these stories. Consequently, this body of information, this body of knowledge is becoming alien. I will be familiar with Ludo. I will not be familiar with the counterpart game that used to exist, even Monopoly. This generation is one that is much more comfortable in English. And that's the reason I'm doing them in English. And I guess what will happen is I also detect a certain degree of interest in people writing on these things, fiction, semi-fiction, retold in English. So I am a bit optimistic, and I'd suspect that people, the younger generation, will read those other versions and then be motivated enough.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Open to questions now, please.
Sir, there is a difficulty when it comes to translation from Sanskrit to English, and it is believed that the essential elements of certain Sanskrit words will not be translated as equivalences in English, and hence when we read it through English, which is a colonial language, we would also have that colonial essence in our mind. How do we overcome this? What would be your suggestion?
There's a simple level answer and there is a more complicated level answer. Both are equally important. What's your name?
I'm Anand Kumar. I'm studying law.
Well, I didn't ask that. I just wanted your name. First, the simple level answer. There are some words that defy translation. Dharma, karma, they cannot be translated. So what I do in my translations is I leave them as they are, except for the first time when I seek to explain them. But there is a more complicated level answer. So let me, even though time is running up, let me give that answer. In Sanskrit and in Indian languages, the noun is not important. The pronoun is not important. It is the verb which is important. So when I ask you for your name, rare is the person, unless the person is westernized, which you probably are a bit. You will not say, I am Anant Kumar. I will always be buried at the background. You will say, my name is Anant Kumar. You will say, I am known by the name of Anant Kumar. When we talk about culture, Sanskrit, it cannot be dealing from language. And a major problem, not the obvious one, I gave the obvious one, a major problem with translating from Sanskrit into English is the entire structure of the language is completely different. And just as a final thought, think of the way we write our letters. All English letters will be actually formed in an counterclockwise fashion. I will write all the circular letters. Think of all the circular letters. I will actually write O like this. All our letters are actually written in a clockwise fashion. All the circular letters. Think about it. Now, this is a much more serious problem with translation, because the same word, ajagara, straightforward English translation, it's a python. Of course it is. But what is ajagara? It is anything that swallows an aja or a goat. So if you were to swallow a goat, you would also be an ajagara. Now, this is a much more difficult problem of translation.
Thank you, sir. It was such an informative session, very interesting as well. Thank you.